Yes, very good. We're now joined by Nadja and Paul, who have just given beautiful performances, as well as by composer Jonathan Dawe, who wrote one of the pieces that Paul will be playing for us later. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So as we just heard, Nadja and Paul are excellent interpreters of Baroque music, and they've mastered the technique of performing on period instruments, that is to say, instruments that are historically accurate. So Paul, maybe you can start by telling us a bit about your passion for Baroque music and about the instrument that you played for us today.
Yeah, sure. The thing about passion for Baroque music is a long answer. What's really fascinating about it is just to explore the way composers were hearing music at the time, playing themselves, and the way musicians were playing. And I always try to emphasize it's not about telling anyone else they're doing it wrong. It's just really about getting a fresh approach to the music. In terms of the instrument, for string instruments, there are a couple main basic differences as opposed to the modern instruments that make the biggest difference in the sound. And those would be the gut strings instead of synthetic, usually steel strings nowadays. So they generally used, I don't know if you want these details, but generally it was B for sheep gut. And then another big difference is the kind of bow we use. And generally at the time, the bows were shorter and lighter and weighted very differently. I like to say, and this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, that earlier instruments actually had a lot more resonance, but they're not as loud. And I think the loudness is one of the driving forces over time to change instruments, because music making went from really small spaces like a court or chamber music to bigger and bigger halls. So projection became more important. On the string instruments, the tension kept rising and rising. So I would say those are the main differences I like about the gut strings, that you hear more of the texture and the tactile nature of it. It's great to have a variety.
Wonderful, yeah. So Nadja, I wonder if you could reflect along similar lines. And some of what Paul said, it seems to me, applies quite well to the harpsichord, such as the tactile quality and also the resonance of the instrument.
Yes, but also in the sound itself, the harpsichord is quite different from, for example, a piano or organ. It's something which is really quite simple. In fact, technically, it's something like a little key which is plugging a string, but this creates really like an other world, very near, very close to the sound of a lute or of a guitar or even of a harp. So it brings, like Paul said, in a world where everything is a little bit more intimate for a smaller audience. And well, when you, for example, when you listen Bach, which was, he wrote many pieces for keyboards, and he was very open when he wrote those pieces, saying you can play it on organ, you can play it on a clavichord. You can see that there is still a very open mind when he is writing this his compositions. And the harpsichord and playing on historical or on period instruments, it's like getting a little of the taste that Bach had himself around him, I think.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And turning back to Paul, in addition to being a prominent interpreter of Baroque literature, You're also an advocate of new work. So you have the taste of the Baroque, but you also are seeking new tastes and new flavors constantly. And so in response to the current pandemic that's engulfing us all, you've launched a new project, which you call COVID-19, Contagious Solitude. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that initiative.
Yeah, sure. I've always loved working with composers and just digging into new music and exploring with them. And it seemed like a great opportunity to reach out to old and new friends, see if they were interested in this too. I know a lot of people are looking for meaningful ways to engage themselves and engage with others. So I've been very grateful, including to yourself, Daniel, and of course, Jonathan, that you've been willing to collaborate and donate your time and work for this.
Keeping a sense of community alive during the time of social isolation is very important for all of us artistically and also emotionally and in personal terms. So Jonathan, when Paul approached you to contribute a piece to this project, what were some of your thoughts that led to the new piece?
Well, I was very happy when Paul contacted me. I think a lot of us are looking for projects that are current and not just existing in our own world. And when he had called, I had embarked on reading the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which is a large extended work from the Middle Ages, which deals with the bubonic plague. And one of the things that kind of struck me as I was reading it, among other things, and of course it's very timely to what we're doing today in our self-isolation, is that they would tell stories to each other. But I found it interesting the way that time was often described, because this is a time before clocks and watches. And so often they would evoke this notion of canonical hours, which were the different periods during the day that would be marked not just by moments and different times when you would pray, but just to kind of have some division of time. And it struck me because I think a lot of us are thinking that way or feel that way about time, that rather than having these increments that are by minutes or even hours, we kind of feel things moving more in these chunks of maybe 3 hours, which is how these different descriptions of time would work. And even if we are scheduled and have, let's say, a Zoom class to do, there's still this strange feeling of time being more malleable. And so the idea of somehow replicating that musically, and I chose the hour of Tess, which is 9 a.m. And I guess one of my metaphors there is that 9 a.m. is kind of the archetypal time when work begins. And we're all kind of waiting for that work day, metaphorically, to begin. And so this is representing the time before that.
Very interested in your answer, Jonathan, because it relates so much to some of the same thoughts I was having, both of sort of the different ways that time is moving now, and also to sort of the looking to the past. In your case, you looked to Boccaccio, but in my case, one of the very last performances I saw live before this pandemic hit was a Constellations Chamber Music concert on March 3rd. And on the program was the 6th Bach Cello Suite, which was performed by Colin Carr. And when Paul approached me a couple weeks later to write a piece, naturally this was sort of an imprint in my head. And so I found that some elements of that Bach suite made it into my piece, especially the prelude, which is sort of this wonderful perpetual motion. Right. And that has some connection to the middle section of my piece, which is also a perpetual motion. It plays some of the same games with register that Bach does, but has maybe a little bit more of an agitated quality. I'm not sure if Paul feels that way, but it's almost like the mind racing during this time, perhaps in the early morning hours, in fact. or maybe in the sleepless hours of the night. And that forms kind of the middle panel of my piece. And then the outer sections deal with other emotional states that I have been feeling during this pandemic. The first is sort of this agitated unease, and the last is this sense of stillness, of really nothing happening, and a kind of immensely slow tempo. So I suppose, there's this question in both our works and in this project of sort of life before this crisis, and then life during this crisis, and how things have changed. And it's changed for all of us as musicians. So turning back to you, Nadja, how has this pandemic impacted your life and work as a musician?
Well, I think for everybody, it's something which brings us to our own sense of life, to a question of what we are, what we do, where we go. And for musicians, it reveals really that, in a way, what we enjoy making music is deeply inside of us, but it's made for being communicated. And then we really need the contact with other people, and to share ideas, to share the joy, all the emotions which are around the society. And it's very strange, but being isolated for music, it's something as beautiful as a little bit sad, of course. And it reminds me that it was, in Baroque time, it was already difficult for some musicians to pursue, to make a living of music. But the power of music reuniting people was stronger. And I hope after this crisis, the people will get more closer to each other and not separated. That's one of my big wishes.
Yes, absolutely. Music is powerfully unifying, and we're living in this climate where we're relying on technologies and on, events such as this, virtual concerts, to have this sort of communal shared experience of music. So turning to you now, Jonathan, you have a varied career as a composer as well as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how this has changed your musical practice, and how do you see the role of these online platforms in sharing music right now?
It's difficult, I think, to really digest a lot of what's going on right now. I do find social media really interesting to be able to get a sense of how other composers are dealing with the isolation. And I do think a tremendous amount of art is going to come out of this situation, but I think it will happen in different ways and at different times. I know that many composers are feeling as if this is not the time to be composing, or don't really feel that, but I do think the subconscious is always at work. So I do think that there'll be really interesting and rather powerful art, I think, that comes out of this.
It'll be fascinating to see how this time reshapes the languages that artists use and the expressive resources. We're all kind of in this position of finding our way mm-hmm. in very untested waters.
Yeah, absolutely.
For most of us. Yeah. And how about from you, Paul? Tell us how your experience of this has been, and also tell us how you expect this commissioning project to unfold, and we can expect in the future.
For me personally, I feel privileged enough to have been able to find silver linings. My wife travels a lot. She's also a musician. So this is the longest we've been at home together probably ever. There's that, but of course there's a lot of anxiety for all of us about when the hour of terce will arrive and we can get back to work. And we know a lot of colleagues who are already struggling to make ends meet. So it's a scary time.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the composition project that involves the two of you, it's a great way for me to stay in touch with some people and keep my mind and fingers active.
Yes, absolutely, which we all need right now. And it's a great gift to the whole musical community to have these kinds of projects underway. So without further ado, now we will hear Paul Dwyer premiere, in fact, Jonathan Dawe's Boo piece.